Bien, mesdames et messieurs, chers collègues, merci d'être venus. J'ai le plaisir de souhaiter la bienvenue au nom du Collège de France à Jursa, professeur à l'Université de Vienne, que beaucoup d'entre vous certainement connaissent, soit personnellement, soit par ses nombreux travaux qui sont bien connus, dont je vais rappeler quelques-uns tout à l'heure, même si, comme on dit d'habitude, et à juste titre dans ce cas, Jursa n'a pas besoin d'être présenté. En général, ça introduit d'ailleurs une introduction. Ce que je vais faire maintenant de manière très, très brève. Donc Jursa, qui d'ailleurs connaît également le Collège de France, qui est venu à plusieurs reprises présenter des communications dans des colloques qui ont été organisés dans le cadre du programme Achaemenid et de la Chaire. Donc Jursa est spécialiste donc, de la Babylonie du premier millénaire et il fait partie de cette... ce n'est plus la première génération de chercheurs sur le premier millénaire qui, il y a 20 ou 25 ans, étaient relativement peu nombreux et dont la voie a été ouverte, en quelque sorte, si je puis dire, par la thèse de Matt Stolper en 1974, puis suivie par de nombreux autres dans de nombreux pays, y compris ici même en France, grâce en particulier à Francis Johannes et à ses élèves. Jursa a écrit de très nombreux livres, a dirigé de nombreux projets, et parmi ces livres et ces projets, je signale simplement deux. Donc, son livre sur la dîme en Babylonie, où il utilise aussi bien les textes de l'époque néo-babylonienne achéménide que l'époque hellénistique, comme cela se fait aujourd'hui désormais. Et d'autre part, il a dirigé pendant 7 ans, de 2002 à 2009, le programme START, qui avait pour but d'étudier très largement la vie économique en Babylonie, qui a donné lieu, entre autres choses, à cet énorme volume dirigé par lui, avec des contributions d'autres spécialistes, où l'ensemble des problèmes économiques et sociaux de la Babylonie sont évoqués, sinon traités ensemble. Donc, Jursa était parfaitement, comment dirais-je, le choix parfait pour, dans le cadre du monde achéménide, venir présenter ses réflexions synthétiques sur la Babylonie à l'époque achéménide. Et donc, vous avez vu le programme, que j'ai quelque part, le voilà. Donc, qui sont des 4 leçons qui sont données les mardis donc, à 11h aujourd'hui et dans les 3 prochaines semaines, jusqu'au 31 janvier. Et vous voyez que ce sont des questions de synthèse qui seront posées par Jursa. Donc je précise, mais le sens de l'invitation était très clair, que Jursa, bien qu'entendant le français, préfère le parler l'anglais, et donc il présentera ses contributions en anglais, et à la fin de la séance, bien entendu, chacun ou chacune sera appelé à poser des questions. Vous pourrez poser vos questions en français si vous voulez, il vous répondra en anglais. Bien, Jursa, vous avez la parole.
Thank you, Pierre, for this introduction. And also, of course, thank you very much for inviting me. I consider it a considerable honor to be able to be here and to give these talks in such a venerable institution of learning as the Collège de France, which has been associated with the forefront of Achaemenid studies for quite a while now. My talks will try to construct a kind of narrative over the whole sequence of 4 events. I will go from the fairly general, synthetic, to more detailed discussions of individual problems as the material merits. So you will see that the 4 topics that are given in the description of these lectures will actually not be distributed in a neat fashion among the 4 lectures, but rather these are general themes which will come up time and again during the sequence of those 4 presentations. My general topic is Babylonia under Persian rule. This is a topic which might easily be exhausted in, say, 2 or 3 hours if one were to restrict oneself to talking about what is considered the communis opinio in the field, and if one were to restrict oneself to what can be considered established knowledge. On the other hand, if I were to present the available sources in their entirety, and if I were to discuss all the questions that come up while reading these sources, and if I were to go into the individual issues that impose themselves upon us when we study this material, we would not finish in 14 hours, let alone in 4. This means that my presentation, as I said, will be general to some extent, but I will stop and discuss in more detail individual problems which seem to me to merit further discussion, or which are particularly profitable for an in-depth analysis. For the narrative I will try to construct over the sequence of those 4 events. I have to apologize. Pierre mentioned it. I have to apologize for speaking in English. My English, unfortunately, is not perfect, but believe me, it is much better than my French. However, as Pierre said, if you have questions, you are very welcome to pose them in French or also in another more or less common European language, and I will then respond in English. Now, of course, I don't have to comment on this in any manner. This is the Achaemenid Empire, its rough extension during the period of its maximum geographical extension and power. The time frame is 539 to 340 roughly, so the period during which Babylonia, so central and southern Mesopotamia, was under the control of Persian overlords. The themes of these lectures are as set out on this slide. I will talk about the political history and the administration of Achaemenid Babylonia. I will talk about the setting of the province of Babylonia in the wider context of the Achaemenid Empire. However, here I have to make a sort of parenthesis. My perspective is fairly rigorously Babylonocentric. I will not take owls to Athens, or maybe we should say Sigloid to Persepolis, talking about the general history of the Achaemenid Empire. There are people in this room, obviously, who are much more qualified to do this than I am. I will concentrate on the Babylonian evidence, especially on the documentary evidence, and I will try to develop the perspective of the Babylonian sources, which then perhaps in the discussion might be put in contrast to the other Greek and also Elamite sources that bear on the same period and partly on the same region. So, Babylonia in the wider context of the empire. I certainly have to talk about socio-economic history of this period and of this region. The aspects of socio-economic development that I will focus on are those aspects which demonstrably reflect the fact, to some extent at least, that Babylonia in this period was under Persian rule. So I will not give you a complete overview, would be impossible, of socio-economic structures in Babylonia in the late Achaemenid period, but rather I will try to concentrate on those aspects where we can see that the fact that Babylonia was part of the Persian Empire has an influence. And finally, I will try to contrast a sort of synchronic view with a more diachronically oriented perspective. I will talk about continuities and ruptures in the history of Achaemenid Babylonia. Continuities that in part link Achaemenid Babylonia to the preceding period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and ruptures both between the administrative and social structures of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and Achaemenid Babylonia on the one hand, and within the historical development of Achaemenid Babylonia during the 200 years of Persian rule on the other hand. These topics, as I said, will crop up time and again during my presentation. The actual structure of the lecture series is as follows. I will introduce the sources. This could potentially be very boring since I can't say that much that is new, but I will try to focus on some interesting aspects. I will introduce the sources. Then I will introduce what one might call the protagonists of the narrative I'm trying to construct. So I will talk about the great king and his family and his nobles as they are reflected in Babylonian sources. I will talk about the royal administration and the bureaucrats or administrators who are employed by the royal administration, be they of Babylonian or Persian origin or of other origin. Egyptians are an important aspect in this at this point. I will talk about native, that is Babylonian institutions, both in the sense of physical institutions such as temples and in the sense of administrative institutions, customs, and so forth. And as I said, I will address aspects of socio-economic development within Babylonia with a special focus on the effects of Persian rule. Introducing these protagonists will then allow me to develop a more dynamic picture of interactions, so of the mutual influence the various protagonists of my narrative have on each other, and in this context we will then talk about continuities and ruptures. I have already explained my modus operandi. I will focus nearly exclusively on the Babylonian documentary record. I will give you general presentations. Interspersed, you will get a more in-depth discussion of individual problems that are either unresearched or under-researched, or in fact have recently been subjected to research, which however requires further discussion. Now, sources. Most of you are familiar with what I can say in this respect. Babylonia in the first millennium in general is certainly one of the best documented periods of antiquity. A rough guess arrives at some 80,000 pertinent cuneiform documents that are housed in Western museums. Of these 80,000 texts, 23 are, say, available for study. By this I mean they are either published or they have been read and have been transliterated, even though they remain unpublished and have been fed into various databases and so forth. These 23,000 tablets are then the material basis on which I can draw. The vast majority of these texts falls into the period that I call the long 6th century. So the period between the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the second year of Xerxes that marks a major watershed in the history of Achaemenid Babylonia, a watershed about which we have to talk further in this series of lectures. So about 85% of the sources fall into these 140 years. The subsequent period of Persian domination over Babylonia is much less well documented. I know of about 2,100 tablets that fall into this period, of which 800 are still unpublished. You see instantly that this division of the sources suggests to divide the period of Persian rule over Babylonia into two phases, before and after 484 BC, and in fact there are good reasons to do so. The preceding period, so the period between 539 and 484, can arguably be subdivided again into the reign of the two Thespids, if one wants to adopt this terminology, so into the reign of Cyrus and Cambyses on the one hand and Darius on the other. On the other hand, we are unfortunately not in a good position to describe diachronic change in the subsequent period. So in the period after 484, there is a certain tendency to lump together all the sources that fall into this period, which is after all still 150 years, so not a short period. When there's this tendency to lump together all these sources under the label of late Achaemenid and treat them as if they were sort of reflecting always the same circumstances. In fact, this is certainly insufficient or problematic. There are various points at which we do see diachronic change and developments in the period after 484. And it will be one of the interests I pursue in this lecture series to concentrate on the internal division of this period post-Xerxes. However, I have to admit already now that this matter needs more research, and the material basis on which we can face this problem is still far from satisfactory. This is a point which I will discuss further in a minute. Our sources come from very few sites, in fact. They come from Sippar, Babylon, Borsippa, Nippur, Uruk, and to a lesser extent to some other of the from some other of the cities that are marked here on the map. These little red and green bars give the number of archives that come from the respective sites. In fact, the numbers are somewhat higher than suggested on this map, since I made this map 2 or 3 years ago. And in the meantime, some other archives have come up. I just didn't have the time to update this graphic. The red bars are archives that were known before 2002, and the green bars are archives that have become known in after 2002. So you see the development of the field is quite rapid. Our knowledge of Borsippa has expanded hugely in the last 10 years, for instance. These sources are very important. I will talk about them later. Also, what we know about Babylon and even Sippar or Uruk has changed quite significantly in the last 10 years. So we are talking here about a rapidly evolving and developing field. Some of the text groups that are particularly relevant for Achaemenid Babylonia are listed on this slide. First, tablets or archives, tablets actually, that fall into the first period, 539 to 484. Mostly we have to do with sources from Sippar, Borsippa, Central Babylonia. I've lumped together Babylon, Kish, Nippur, Dilbat, and then the south, mostly represented by Uruk, but there are also, of course, some texts from Larsa and from The general trend is that the period of Darius's reign is better documented than the preceding period of the Thespids. Nevertheless, we do have significant data also for Cyrus and Cambyses. However, the admittedly longer period of Darius's reign tends to be better documented. The only exception is the south, where we have a major juncture at basically around the second year of Darius, since the Eanna archive more or less comes to an end at that time. Overall, we have 3,000 something texts from the reign of Cyrus and Cambyses, and 4,100 from the reign of Darius up to 484. The most important archives, of course, the two temple archives of the archive of the Eanna temple in the south in Uruk, and the archive of the temple of the sun god Shamash, Ebabar, in Sippar in the north. These temple archives will have to be cited time and again in this presentation, as they form the background, the backbone of the narrative I attempt to construct. The documents of private origin can be grouped very roughly into two large categories: family archives of businessmen, non-priests, basically. The most important, or some of the more important, are listed on the slide. Of course, you are all familiar with the famous Egibi archive, which is an extremely important source for the reign of Darius. The Iti Shamash Balatu archive, the archive of an entrepreneur based in southern Larsa, is quite important for the reign of the Thespids, especially Cyrus. And we have also the archive of an entrepreneur based in Nippur, a certain Beliteri Shamash, which is interesting for the fact that it has equally important part of the archive in the preceding Neo-Babylonian period and in the Persian period, which allows one to analyze aspects of continuity and change in Nippur. The family archives of priests are overall more numerous than the archives of businessmen. They show us a different perspective, which will be also important for the presentations here. I want to point out in particular the documentation from Borsippa, which has come to light to a large extent only in the last 10 years or so. These Borsippa archives are very, very important for the reign of Darius. We have some 2,000 something, how many? Near 2,800 according to my count here, maybe even a little bit more. Texts from the Persian period from this city. And to a large extent, these archives still remain unpublished. Of course, Caroline Wasich has published an important book on the subject, but there are many other aspects of these sources that still need detailed elaboration and study. The archives, individual archives, I want to point out, include the Re Alpi archive of some 400 tablets, so a large private archive, and the several Ilia archives. There are several branches of this family that have left us archives. For us, especially important is the archive Ilia D, so the fourth, which is the archive of a family that for some time held very important administrative positions. Talking about later periods, about the later period, it is much more easy to be comprehensive here since numbers are much smaller. We have one temple archive, the Sangala archive, which consists of over 300 tablets, maybe even 400. The borders of this archive are ill-defined, and in fact the number may be significantly larger than 350. These 350 are a conservative estimate. 2/3 of the archive are still unpublished. The Murashu archive, of course, is perhaps after the EGB archive the best known archive of all Neo-Babylonian archives, has been studied by Matt Stolper, Kadasha also. I don't have to say much about it, 730 tablets according to Stolper's count. Kasra and Tatano are two private archives of families of Babylonian landholders who were really very, very, very rich, and who in part also had important official functions and roles. So these are important sources that throw the Murashu archive in a new light. Unfortunately, neither the Kasra archive nor the Tatano archive have been studied comprehensively. This is now in course of being done. A student of Matthew Stolper's is working on these two archives. We have the Galabo archive from Ur, the only southern archive that merits mention here. And then we have numerous small dossiers and isolated texts from central Babylonia. These texts have increased in number significantly in recent years. My student Johannes Hackel is writing a PhD thesis on them, and he has sort of doubled the number of texts that fall into this category and also into the category of the Isangela archive. All these texts are in the British Museum. They are very important sources or potentially very important sources for later Achaemenid history in Babylonia. However, they present us with a very unpleasant problem that is not easily resolved, and that is their dating. In fact, these texts are dated, But as you see explained on the slide, we have 3 kings bearing the same name in this period, Artaxerxes I, II, and III, who together overall account for more than half of the period under discussion. And as such, the Babylonian dating is not sufficient to establish whether a text comes from the reign of Artaxerxes I, the second, or the third. And the problem is compounded by the fact that both Artaxerxes I and the second had very long reigns. So even year 30 can be Artaxerxes I or Artaxerxes II. With isolated texts that don't give prosopographical data that allows a secure dating, we are forced to, using tablet format, script, orthography, and such criteria as dating criteria. This is this is a branch of assyriology we might call diplomatics, so the study of tablet formats and so forth, which one has to admit that Babylonian diplomatics is certainly underdeveloped, at least for the first millennium. One of our research projects in Vienna focuses on diplomatics in this sense. So we are trying to establish criteria, especially for the later Achaemenid period, that allow us to securely date texts, especially texts that are dated to the reign of one of these Artaxerxeses. I'll just show you how this can be done in a very superficial manner, since this is an argument which will evolve over time and potentially might interest some of the people present here in this room. This is a text from the reign of Xerxes, which, if I wouldn't know that it's from Xerxes, just looking at it, I would say it is from Northern Babylonian, comes from the reign of Darius. Since these texts are very more frequent than those of Xerxes. It has the same tablet format, the same shape, the same ductus that is typical for texts from Darius. There is no visible break that distinguishes these Xerxes texts from the preceding phase of the long 6th century. You see the tablet is fairly slim. Now if we go to early Artaxerxes, you see that tablets become thicker, and the script tends to be less evenly spaced, and line spaces grow. Especially the thickness of the tablet is an important indication. If you see something like this, it's, I venture to say, nearly never, or maybe even never, earlier than Artaxerxes, or potentially very late in the reign of Xerxes. Now, during the long reign of Artaxerxes, we have important developments. Artaxerxes will be one of the heroes of my narrative here. This is late Artaxerxes, and you see a significant development again. Tablet shapes tend to be larger. We find many more tablets that have this brick-like shape that was reserved to particular document types earlier. It's now much more frequent, also for general common types of transactions. The script can still be quite neat, but line spacing is comparatively large, and we get particular forms of sealing. So again, the difference here is quite notable. And now if we move to Artaxerxes II, you see again a significant leap. The tablets are even larger, and they tend to be squarish rather than oblong. And edges, which you don't see very well on this example, but on better preserved specimen, it is better visible. The corners tend to be round rather than very angular, as in this case. So just looking at this text, also with its not extremely neat lines and even wider line spacing, looking at these texts and having seen several of them, it is fairly easy to recognize them as being from the reign of Artaxerxes II, and or rather I should say, it's fairly easy to recognize them as being not from the reign of Artaxerxes I. The problem that we have and on which we're working now is distinguishing Artaxerxes II and III. Tablets from the reign of Artaxerxes III don't look much different from those of the reign of Artaxerxes II. So this is something we still need to work on. In any case, it's already quite important that with these criteria we have a fairly good basis for isolating texts from Artaxerxes I from texts from the reigns of Artaxerxes II and III. Just to show you how this continues, this is Alexander III. Fairly similar still to Artaxerxes II and III. However, lines tend to become even more irregular, and there are particular characteristics of the sealings that allow us to distinguish these early Hellenistic and early Seleucid texts from the preceding late Achaemenid phase. And finally, just one example of a very late text from the early 2nd century. This particular type of sealing, the tablet format, which is reminiscent of manuscripts of literary texts from the Hellenistic period, is very distinct. So looking at these texts, one instantly sees they are Seleucid and fairly late. As I said, I dealt with this in some detail because it's ongoing research and because it's, I think, research that eventually will be quite important for getting a better understanding of the late Achaemenid period. Now, I will talk about the protagonists of Babylonian history under Persian rule in the sequence you see set out on this slide. So first, I'll talk about the great king, his family, and his nobles. By nobles, from a Babylonian perspective, I simply mean important Persians. I will not go into the exact definition of this term in a sort of emic Persian perspective. For the Babylonians, they knew an important Persian when they saw one, I would say, but the Babylonian sources don't give us any clues, or very few clues, as to the stratification of a Persian society as seen by Babylonian eyes. So, king and his nobles, royal administration, and the officials who work for the royal administration. An important point here is the distinction between men of Persian origin, usually on the upper echelons of the administrative hierarchy, and Babylonians and others who tend to take the lower positions in this hierarchy. Babylonian institutions and Babylonian society are topics about which I will not be able to say very much in this lecture here. We will continue with this sequence in the lecture next week. So first, the great king. I distinguish three types of references to the great king. First, invocations of the royal persona. You will see in a minute what I intend by this slightly odd phrasing, perhaps. The second point, references to royal acts, decrees, and policies, includes also explicit references to the presence of the king in Babylonia. The presence of the king in Babylonia, I should add, which also implies interaction with Babylonians. And finally, third category, presence of the king in Babylonia, which is attested only indirectly in one way or another. Now, first, invocations of the royal persona. Coming from the perspective of a person who has worked much on the preceding history of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, one of the first observations that strikes one is, when studying the Achaemenid documentation, is the comparative absence of references to the king. He is, of course, mentioned, but he is mentioned in particular ways that are quite distinct from what we find in earlier periods, in the earlier period, I should say. First, fairly frequently we find the king being invoked in oaths, oaths that also invoke the gods, but next to gods, the king is mentioned, or more specifically, the oath of allegiance to the king. So the Akkadian phrasing is in Baal Nabu u Adesha Sharitemu, swearing by god Baal, by Nabu, and by the Ade of the king, or of then royal name. Adu or Ade is a concept that has been discussed quite frequently. This word may mean oath of allegiance. It does so demonstrably in the Neo-Assyrian period. According to the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, in this period and in the preceding Neo-Babylonian period, and in these phrases, we should translate Ade rather as majesty or some such thing. So this would then be an oath by the gods Baal and Nabu and by the majesty of the king. For the Neo-Babylonian Empire, I think I can now demonstrate that Adu in fact means oath of allegiance. And in this preceding period, these oath formulae are used nearly exclusively, not entirely exclusively, but nearly exclusively in contexts that involve the royal administration. So these oath formulae are used whenever an official or someone who has obligations vis-à-vis the royal administration has to prove that he has done his duty by the king. And this reference to doing the duty by the king is referred to by invocation of an oath of office that has been sworn. For the Neo-Babylonian period, as I said, we can demonstrate that as in the preceding Neo-Assyrian period, generally officials at least had to swear such an oath of office. Now, it is hard to prove, basing oneself on independent Achaemenid period data, that Adu in this period has the same meaning as in the preceding Neo-Babylonian period. I cannot prove for the Achaemenid period on the basis of independent information that officials had to swear an oath by the king. There are indirect references, and it's certainly possible, but it's not certain. And it is also true that we find this invocation of the Adu of the king in the Achaemenid period in contexts which do not seem to involve obligations that are of relevance for the king or his administration. So we might assume that this phrase was used in a more generalized manner in the Achaemenid period as a sort of reminiscence of earlier Neo-Babylonian practice, but this would imply that it didn't have its literal meaning anymore, but that it was a sort of fossilized formula kept by sort of out of convenience or habit. On the other hand, we have to note that the distribution of this formula is fairly striking. It never occurs in Borsippa, for instance. In Borsippa, these priests always swear by Baal Nabu and the king, not by the Adu of the king. So perhaps there is something specific after all to these mentions of Adu. This is subject of further research. I can't give you a definitive answer at this point. Whether or not Babylonian officials had to swear this oath as in the preceding Neo-Babylonian period or not. I consider it possible, but hitherto uncertain. In any case, the king is invoked here in a sort of general manner. He is invoked as, well, the royal persona is invoked, but it doesn't involve a very clear image of a present king, as it were. The same is true for phrases, for penalties clauses that invoke the potential penalty of the king. This is something which also is known in the earlier Neo-Babylonian period. a research project in the United States currently investigates this phrase. Their argument is that these clauses that invoke the penalty of the king for administrative malfeasance, official misconduct, should be seen as evidence for administrative law, so for a body of regulations that is separate from other legal regulations and has a bearing specifically and exclusively on the relations between the king and his officials. So this specificity of usage of this formula that can be demonstrated for the Neo-Babylonian period is also present for the Achaemenid period. So in this sense, there is clearly a continuity of administrative traditions and administrative practices. Also here, of course, penalty of the king does not imply necessarily penalty meted out by the king in person. It is just the person of the king, it's the administration that is intended here and not Darius himself or Cyrus. Occasionally we find phrases such as the one quoted here from the letter CT 2274, Bagane Dariavus Shari Namuchika, the summons of King Darius are upon you, literally. The first word is an Aramaic loan. Functionally, these phrases, they occur 2-3 times, correspond to earlier Amachari Namuchi so-and-so, the word of the king is upon someone. This phrase can be interpreted on the basis of various dossiers. It means not necessarily, potentially it may mean also a summon before the king, but this is not demonstrably the case in all these instances. It certainly always means that the person that is these phrases refer to is called for a reckoning with the royal administration, with his superiors, a reckoning that is important and that is backed by the full authority of the king, that is of the state, if you wish. What we do not find in the fairly voluminous correspondence of Babylonian officials of the Achaemenid period, something I'm studying at the time, this is references like the one I'm quoting here from a Neo-Babylonian letter. So one Neo-Babylonian official who is based in Babylon writes to his colleague in Uruk, the king is apoplectic with rage. Yeah? We find references such as Nabonidus has beat up our messenger. We get, the point is, we get in this period informations, vivid informations, first-hand informations from the court. And these informations refer to the person of the king. The correspondence of these Neo-Babylonian officials, they see the Neo-Babylonian king. They speak with him, they are in contact with him. Something like this never ever occurs in the official correspondence of the Achaemenid period. Occasionally, these letters refer to the king, or they say that someone is going to the palace or some such thing. But we never get this kind of personalized information about the king, such as here, the king is horribly furious or some such thing. It just doesn't occur. And this means that from my point of view, the great king for Babylonian officials is clearly quite remote and basically inaccessible. We have to develop this argument, but from the evidence I've discussed so far, this is fairly clear, I think. Now, second point, explicit references to royal acts, decrees, policies. Here, of course, we should mention first the evidence for the data of the king. This is something that has been studied repeatedly by Sophie Lafont, by Christine Kleber, and others. Data of the king, these seem to be royal rulings. Other scholars have suggested laws. This goes perhaps a bit too far. Royal rulings is a translation I personally am fairly happy with from the viewpoint of the Babylonian evidence, but one might discuss this further. These are royal rulings that have a bearing on the 5 subjects I list here. So law of slavery, sanctions for theft and robbery, tariffs regarding taxes and such things, sanctions for malfeasance of tax collectors, and the handling of deposits and giro payments. The impression is that most of these data sort of give quantitative information. So they tell who is to pay what for which kind of service or for which kind of transaction. On the other hand, of course, it may be that we just see the tip of the iceberg and that there was a much more voluminous body of such rulings that simply are not explicitly referred to in our documents. One text says that for arriving at the solution of a court case, the judges opened P2 the data of the king. So we have to assume that, well, these things circulated in some written form and were consulted regularly. But about their nature, of course, we can only speculate on the basis of the information we have, and also, of course, on the basis of a possible reference to such rulings that we can find in the Bisotun inscription. In at least one instance, data interchanges with dino, with the Akkadian word that means legal ruling, so we get an idea how the Akkadian language and the concepts that lie behind the Akkadian language conceptualized the data, which on the other hand is regularly referred to by the Persian loanword, which suggests that for the Babylonians it was something specific. As I said, under this heading here, I also want to discuss interactions of the king with Babylonians. One of the ways in which Babylonians conceivably might interact with the king, and probably also did interact, at least in some cases, with the king, is the context of the courts of law. We have one instance of a Murashu text where perhaps reference is made to a petition of Judean settler soldiers to Darius II. The verb is reconstructed, so it usually people read ikbu, so they said to Darius at this point, but we might also put a verb that involves writing. Potentially. I would consider the evidence of this text slightly ambiguous. It may be an instance where we have explicit information of the king hearing a case that involves Babylonians, the Murashu, in fact. It may also be a reference to a petition made to the king. I would not exclude the second possibility. Then the royal court of law may play a role in the trips of the Babylonian notables to Susa. This has recently been studied by the Paris dissertation of Gauthier Toligny. The evidence for the Susa trips has also been collected in a recent article by Caroline Warsechers. If you read through this documentation, the idea that these Babylonian notables who have to make this long trip to Susa may have had to appear to justify themselves is so this assumption imposes itself. However, whether this necessarily was a court that was presided by the king is uncertain, and overall the interpretation of this Susa dossier, or at least of parts of the Susa dossier, is perhaps also a matter that may merit further discussion. I will return to this point at a later stage of this lecture series. At the moment, I just would want to emphasize that these trips to Susa may involve also in direct interaction with the king in a legal context. However, these are exceptions, and overall, again, also with the Babylonian documentation from the preceding Neo-Babylonian period in mind, the conclusion that the great king is remote and inaccessible, I think, must stand. There may be exceptions, but overall, in comparison to earlier periods, the king was a remote and fairly shadowy figure. Indirect attestations of the great king. Well, we know about the itinerant court, which may imply a regular presence of the king in the palace in Babylon, from Darius onwards perhaps, and certainly in the later Achaemenid period. The Babylonian documentary record occasionally reflects this by references to particular service obligations that involve the palace in Babylon, and by reference to obligations to provide provisions for the palace in Babylon. These obligations may imply the presence of the court. They may also conceivably imply simply the presence of royal officials or of royal personnel in the palace throughout the year. But I think overall we can be fairly certain that at least some of this evidence will refer to actual presence of the court in Babylon. The work on the palaces as such that is documented archaeologically clearly implies the interest of the great kings in this site. They wouldn't have done considerable work on the palace in Babylon hadn't they intended to live there at least occasionally. The archaeological evidence for these palaces, or that palace in Babylon, has recently been reinvestigated, and the general trend seems to be to date into the Achaemenid or even later Seleucid period some of the construction work that traditionally was associated with the Neo-Babylonian period. And finally, indirect references to the presence of the king come from the dossiers that refer to palace building under Cyrus and Cambyses, mostly in southeastern Babylonia. These dossiers mostly come from the Anna archive, and they have recently been studied. So I do not have to say very much about them. Now, after the king, the royal family and nobles. One important point that is striking the documentation, since it has no clear correspondence in the early Neo-Babylonian period, is the evidence for land ownership of queens, princes, and generally high-ranking Persians. These latifundia, if you wish, of Persian nobles and members of the royal family are an important feature of the Nippur Murashu documentation, which is why they have had a large influence on the general image that has been constructed of Achaemenid Babylonia. However, without wanting to deny the importance of this landholding of elite Persians, I would want to emphasize that the situation in Nippur is a slightly anomalous situation, in that Nippur was for a long period something of an agricultural backwater, and was not subjected to the rapid agrarian expansion and investment, and the important investment schemes that have transformed the agricultural landscape of other Babylonian cities, such as Babylon or Borsippa or Sippa in the Neo-Babylonian period, so in the 6th century. Nothing much happened in Nippur in the 6th century, and there was clearly space around Nippur to establish potentially also new holdings. So Nippur is slightly anomalous. On the other hand, it is clear that the trend that the documentation for important landholding of Persian officials tends to come from the 5th century is a valid trend. From the preceding period of the reigns of Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius, we have much less evidence for that sort of thing. Occasionally, we do hear of land, agricultural land belonging to Persians, but these are rare instances before 484. Large-scale landholding, at least from the viewpoint of the Babylonian documentation, large-scale landholding of Persians is a phenomenon of the 5th century and presumably of the 4th century, not of the late 6th century. But we do know, for instance, that Cambyses took over sort of one-to-one the household of the Babylonian crown prince, which did include also landholdings. So some agricultural land that had belonged to the Babylonian kings clearly fell into the hands of the Persian royal family. But overall, the phenomenon that we see in the Nippur texts from the 5th century is a phenomenon that has no clear correspondence in the earlier documentation from the late 6th and early 5th centuries. And then again, as I said, the Nippur situation is also particular in that Nippur was this agricultural developing area in which there was space for expansion, space that was put to good use by the Persian administration in the 5th century. So we have a concentration of landholdings in marginal, or at least not strongly urbanized parts of Babylonia. This is my conclusion, which to some extent reflects the distribution of royal land in the Neo-Babylonian period. Also in the Neo-Babylonian period, we see that royal land tends to be marginal land. It's not highly developed, and it's not usually found around the cities, but rather in the hinterland. Urban properties of Persians, mostly in Babylon. So this happened with this we find fairly early in the documentation. So it seems to be a trend that important Persians try to get houses, real estate, if you wish, in Babylon, in the center, or at least in this marginal center of power. There is much less evidence for houses owned by Persians from any of the other cities that are fairly well documented in this period than from Babylon. So the pattern of the documentation is fairly clear. Persians, when they are involved in business, usually, in many cases, act through slaves. I'm coming to the end now of what I want to say today. They usually act through slaves, so Ardu, or usually not Kalu. This seems to be a terminological oddity that needs further thought. And whenever these slaves are engaged in business, we notice that there is a tendency that they do business with non-Babylonians. So, of course, cases in which such slaves of high-ranking Persians do business with Babylonians are known. I do not want to deny this, but it is quite clear that this tendency of engaging in business with non-Babylonians is a valid tendency visible in the sources. This reflects something I will talk about later, next week. It reflects what I want to call the closed mentality of Babylonian urban society. These people do not really like to engage with non-Babylonians. It seems to be a quite distinct characteristic. The Babylonian cuneiform documentation is for Babylonians, well, not for Babylonians only, clearly, but it is something which has a distinct setting in a very distinct society that is not open or does not open itself very easily to outsiders. One typical example, and with this I will close, an unpublished text which I've picked out more or less at random, but which is, however, characteristic. It's a debt note for silver, which is owed to the slave, Ardu, of a high-ranking Persian, whom we can't identify. by a man bearing a Babylonian name but an Aramaic patronym. So this man is probably of West Semitic origin. And among the witnesses, we have another slave of this Persian Bagapanu, who bears a West Semitic name, and we have two Egyptians. And just only the scribe is a Babylonian. This kind of distribution of protagonists and witnesses would be completely atypical for a standard document from a Babylonian archive, especially during the reign of Darius. In the 5th century, you find this kind of thing slightly more often, but for the 6th century, it's completely unusual. And this reflects the point I made here, this sort of closed Babylonian mentality, their unwillingness to engage with outsiders, even on a commercial plane. At this point, I will stop, and I thank you for your attention.